Before I get into this video, I want to make it clear that this is for entertainment and research purposes and is not aimed to carelessly criticize Chester Bennington as a singer. He was one of the greatest rock vocalists of our time, but because of that way of thinking, people just tend to say, oh, he was great, he was talented. End of story. Even though both of the statements are correct, there was so much more that he did to maintain his voice and become even better over the years. Even with his level of raw talent, there was so much more work Chester put into his craft that is usually overlooked. Hopefully, I will be able to do a decent job of covering the evolution of Chester's voice throughout his career. I think I can safely say that you can prepare yourselves for the most detailed breakdown of Chester's voice, at least on YouTube. If I got your attention, drop a like, buckle in, and let's get right into it. Technically, I have spoken about Chester's voice during the Great Daze era in episode 5 of this series, but I will touch upon it briefly since we got to hear a fresh take on the old material of Great Daze in the new album released last summer titled Amends. I highly recommend for you to hear it if you didn't yet. The vocal takes on the record are from when Chester was still in Great Daze back in 90s, but the arrangements of the songs have been changed. I would have to say that on these early recordings, he really did give some of his best performances. First of all, it seems to me that he originally gravitated towards a more classical rock style of singing. Secondly, Great Daze have never gotten big, so Chester didn't have to wear his voice out with very extensive touring, which was yet to happen further in his career. But of course, he has done a lot of fine-tuning throughout his time with Linkin Park and technically has become a better singer. But his tone lost a bit of the edge towards the end of his career, due to the aforementioned extensive touring, huge back catalog, and of course, age. Besides, he must have been going through a very difficult time in the last few months leading up to his death. Now, let's pick up where I left off in the previous episode. It's 1999. Chester has parted ways with Great Daze and is contacted by Jeff Blue, the vice president of Zomba Music. The audition was, of course, for Linkin Park, or Zero, as they were called at the time. The first recording Chester did with the band was titled And One, and it was indeed an impressive start for him as the new lead singer of the band.
We're gonna play another song that's not on the album. It's real old. It's the first song we wrote when Chester came into the band. It's called And One.
Disjointed heart, I've got no commitments to my own fresh boundaries. Keep it locked up inside. Keep my distance from your eyes.
The most obvious difference from his previous band is the change of his singing style. He pretty much cut ties with his grunge approach and mostly got rid of vibrato, especially when belting, which made for a much more updated and modern sound. He began implementing screaming to his style as well, and in some instances even rapped along with the band's rapper Mike Shinoda. In my opinion, the only misfire in the stylistic sense of Chester's performance was on the track titled Part of Me, the closing track of their first EP, Hybrid Theory. That performance was good, but overall felt out of place. Chester made a drastic change to his singing approach, which showed his versatility and adaptability as a singer who prioritizes the overall sound of the band by doing what serves best any particular song. Important to point out Chester's screaming technique, as he in many ways was one of the singers who made screaming more accessible within the mainstream music scene. His screams were very controlled and highly compressed, which allowed for a very stable sound, and he connected his screams to his singing very well. I'd say some of his screams were more sung than actually screamed, because usually there was a pitch in his scream, and he always went about it in a healthy, thought-out way, which did not hurt his voice. He did not go for that fry scream, which also may sound rather weak when isolated. Very importantly, his screams never lost his character. You could always tell it was him when you just heard his performance, which is something I cannot say about most modern metal screamers, who for the most part sound very much alike and add no unique character to their performance. Techniques like fry scream and mid to low growls in most cases require some amplification or processing in order to sound big or good. Chester, however, never had issues with that. His screams were always very broad, well projected, and as powerful as his singing voice was. Of course, everyone is familiar with Linkin Park's best-selling breakthrough album, Hybrid Theory. Besides, I have recently made a video covering the album in great detail. You may want to check it out. I will leave a link in the description below. So there is no need for us to discuss the recording itself, as it's stellar work by Chester, of course, with some interesting yet minimalistic harmonies and layering. What is worth talking about is Chester's live performances of that time period. His early live shows were very solid considering the intensity of his performances. Some songs of course took time for Chester to get used to, as some of them were written within 4 weeks of recording sessions of Hybrid Theory, and in some cases his live performances were nearly perfect, but of course, performing his material at least 5 times a week must have been very overwhelming for him. We also need to take into account that Linkin Park played over 320 shows throughout 2001. It's difficult to grasp how Chester managed to get through all that touring without completely blowing out his voice. One of the most difficult songs for him to tackle live was of course Crawling, the chorus of that song to be exact. In the early stages, he tried performing it live exactly as he did on the recording, with a lot of distortion in his voice, which would prove difficult as there is quite a bit of layering going on the actual studio version.
Confusing what is real.
Understandably, as a frontman of a new band, Chester probably felt that he had to prove he could do justice to the recording in the live setting, but as a result, during some live shows, his performances of the song was pitchy and unstable.
Crawling in my skin. These wounds, they will not heal. Fear is how I fall.
So by the end of 2001, he began to take some distortion off of his tone during the chorus, which resulted in a much more precise and clean performance.
Crawling in my skin. These wounds, they will not heal. Fear is how I fall.
There were difficulties on the technical side as well, because in the early days of Hybrid Theory tour cycle, the band did not have in-ear monitors, the absence of which can very significantly affect a singer's performance. Without in-ear monitors, it very much is a gamble and is dependent on the venue as to how well the singer will be able to hear their own voice.
It was so hard back then for him because he couldn't hear. I remember he couldn't hear. You know, every club sounds different, and sometimes the sound on stage was just garbage. So he'd be all pitchy, and that would make him more mad, and then he'd play crazier. he was just screaming mad. He couldn't hear himself.
And none of us have in-ears at this point, I don't think, right?
Nah, it's just...
Here comes the scream.
In contrast, this is the performance when the band finally got to use in-ear monitors, which helped Chester hear his voice better and isolated any incoming ambient. There were good and average performances with and without in-ear monitors, so Chester's condition, technique and technical support all played a role in his performances on different occasions. Another song he had difficulties with live was Papercut, not the entire song but this particular section. And you can tell, this section was often pitchy and unstable. I think in addition to not having in-ear monitors early on, he had difficulty in this particular section because this was most likely his passaggio or bridge, a point where chest voice transitions into head voice. Because of this transition, many singers have difficulty finding balance in this particular area of their voice. Bridging area is unique to each singer and voice type, and these weaknesses usually come out when a singer is getting tired. As I'm pretty sure, if Chester was fresh, he'd find this part much easier to sing. Also, he sings this part clean, but in case you're singing in your passaggio, sometimes engaging into distortion helps, as it serves as a sort of anchor for the placement of singer's voice. So in some cases, vocal distortion is helpful not just for conveying a certain emotion, but also for connecting and placing your voice properly. Of course, if distortion is done right, which is something Chester did not have trouble with. But in this part of the song, a clean voice sounds more appropriate, so Chester had to make it work with clean singing approach. He even sings one of the lines higher than it was originally on the recording, to get away from the discomfort of singing right in the passaggio area. To do so, in later performances, Mike sang in E4 instead of Chester, while Chester went higher to G♯4, which also resulted in a beautiful harmony and a more accurate representation of the recorded version of the track. This way, Chester was able to avoid the uncomfortable section of the song in later live shows. It's a common misconception that the higher you sing, the harder it gets, but as the matter of fact, it's usually the bridging area that is the hardest to master for most singers. Something important I need to note is that when I do research about any of the singers, I check with opinions of other vocalists and coaches just to be as objective as possible in my personal assessment. And the biggest misconception about Chester I found is about his vocal range. Some say he had an unusual vocal range, which is absolutely a false claim. His range was quite common for a tenor, and this is something that any average singer could tell you. What did separate Chester from others was his tone and how he used his range. And from his 3-octave range, he mostly used just 2 octaves, especially in this early period I'm talking about today. He cut off extreme lows in his chest register and extreme highs in his head register, and settled in the middle where he was most comfortable, which was a very clever thing to do in the long run. In fact, the very top of his range he used for screams exclusively. Being a tenor, Chester had a naturally light voice, but due to his usage of distortion when belting, his voice sounded rather heavy and well projected. And the truth is that for his voice type, he sang rather low even when belting, usually staying within C4 to A4 range. In fact, he never went above A♯4 on Hybrid Theory. The exceptions would be the screaming parts on By Myself, where he goes up to D5. As a result, he sounded heavy in his mix, in which he pushed for a more of a chesty sound with distortion. This approach he typically used in the choruses. His approach on the verses was usually the opposite, as he was quite light and heady on the softer song sections. This dynamic in his singing approach is what made his voice so appealing to the audiences across the board. Very importantly, Chester was mindful of the material he was presented with, as Linkin Park always wrote the instrumentals first, before Chester could proceed to work on vocals together with Mike. He did what served the song best without showing off or going overboard. His parts were very minimalistic, as he was not a very big fan of runs or even harmonies. His choruses were usually limited to a variation of 3 to 4 notes, which again suited the style of Linkin Park's music very well. With the next two records, Reanimation and Meteora, Chester's voice and approach did not change much on the record, though it's worth noting that the recording process was not easy for him.
Chester, tell me about today, Chester. How was today?
Today, kids, we rewrote a song for the 97th time.
Which is something that is important to understand when you take into consideration his level of voice control.
Taking 8 months off and coming in to do a record, I'm like, am I gonna be as good as I was? Can I do what I want to do in my head? Because I'm so hard on myself, I really push my throat to its ultimate level, and when I push it there and I keep doing it, it ends up getting used to it. And then I can push a little bit harder and get a little bit higher or a little bit lower.
Chester has this incredible weird thing when he sings really aggressive. He has like 2 or 3 different voices inside his voice. You can hear 2 or 3 different notes, and it's the strangest thing in the world.
During the recording of Meteora, Chester was sick for 4 weeks.
Getting sick is like something that's normal, you know? I mean, it happens. Getting sick while you're recording a record is kind of something that you kind of really dread.
Chester, where are we?
We're in New York.
What are we doing?
We're finishing the album and mixing
Why are we doing that?
because I wasn't talented enough to write good parts before we came to mix.
I've been sick for 5 weeks.
And I think it's important to know that even the very talented singers have obstacles and limitations. And just because we always hear the final perfect result of any given song, it doesn't mean it was easy to accomplish. It's this persistency and hard work that made Chester the singer he was. During the live shows of Meteora Era, Chester proceeded to approach his live performances very strategically and cautiously. He used distortion sparingly during those huge choruses, instead relying on a clean voice more and throwing in a distorted phrase occasionally for more impact in his performances, which eventually became a staple of his. But this was his way of reserving energy for the rest of the set and the shows that would follow, thus avoiding a burnout during a tour. Chester was a humble and clever singer who was constantly improving, and this is a trait of any great singer that gradually grows and becomes better at their craft. This will be it for today, as the video is getting much longer than I planned it to be. I think that the next video in this series will be the last on Chester's voice, as he did not go through that many voice changes in his singing career, unlike, let's say, Corey Taylor, whom I have covered extensively. You can watch Corey Taylor episodes by clicking one of the icons displayed on the screen, or follow the links in the description. You can also check previous episode on Chester or the documentary I made about hybrid theory. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, leave a comment and subscribe if you are new to my channel. Don't forget to ring the bell, and take care, and I hope to see you in my next video.